A brief overview of Søren Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript, the principal ideas of which are: the subjective thinker is an engaged thinker, one who by his activity commits himself to an understanding of the truth which by the manner of his existence he is. He seeks to comprehend himself not as an abstraction, but as an ethically engaged existing subject. Only individuals matter. Existence is individual in character. An existent individual is one in the process of becoming. He moves into an uncertain future. Since death is imminent, every choice has infinite worth. Every moment is a unique occasion for decisive action. Each individual achieves his being through decision. In his development, the thinker may pass through the aesthetical stage, in which he experiments but does not commit himself, the ethical stage, in which he acts decisively and commits himself, to the religious stage, in which his sin is acknowledged and he commits himself to God. Kierkegaard has been called the Danish Socrates. The concluding unscientific postscript to the philosophical Fragments, which is the central point of his whole authorship, bears out Kierkegaard's legitimate claim to his title. For in the postscript, Socrates is acknowledged as the illustrious Greek who never lost sight of the fact that a thinker remains an existing individual. The Socratic meiotic method, with its use of ignorance, irony, and dialectics, pervades the whole work. The Athenian gadfly reappears in these pages in a modern counterpart. The Socratic method is used by Johannes Climacus, which is Kierkegaard's pseudonym, to elicit from the reader an awareness that truth is subjectivity. The doctrine of the subjective thinker stands at the centre of this classic. It provides the pivot point around which all the theorems revolve. The subjective thinker is the engaged or involved thinker whose thought, directed toward a penetration of his inner consciousness, moves in passion and earnestness. He finds in the theoretical detachment of objective reflection a comic neglect of the existing individual who does the reflecting. Objective reflection tends to make the subject accidental and transforms his existence into something indifferent and abstract. The accent for the subjective thinker falls on the how. The accent for the objective reflection falls on the what. Objective truth designates a what or an objective content that can be observed in theoretical detachment. Subjective truth is a how that must be inwardly appropriated. Truth as subjectively thus becomes inward appropriation. Truth subjectively appropriated is a truth which is true for me. It is a truth which I live, not merely observe. It is a truth which I am, not merely possess. Truth is a mode of action or a manner of existence. The subjective thinker lives the truth, he exists it. One need not proceed far into the pages of the postscript to become aware that Kierkegaard's arch-enemy, against whom his Socratic ironical barbs are directed, is Hegel. Johannes Climacus finds in the systematized, objective, and theoretical reflection of Hegel's philosophy a fantastic distortion of truth and an ingenious system of irrelevancy. Climacus never tires of harpooning the system. The Hegelian, in neglecting the crucial distinction between thought and reality, erects a system of thought which comically excludes his own existence. He seeks to comprehend himself as an expression of abstract, universal, and timeless categories. Thus he loses himself as a concrete particular and temporal existence. To quote, "One must therefore be very careful in dealing with a philosopher of the Hegelian school, and above all to make certain of the identity of the being with whom one has the honour to discourse. Is he a human being, an existent human being? Is he himself sub specie aeterni, even when he sleeps, eats, blows his nose, or whatever else a human being does? Is he himself the pure I am I? Does he in fact exist? The Hegelian affords an instance of philosophical comedy in which we have thought without a thinker. He erects a marvellous intellectual palace in which he himself does not live. The subject in Hegel's objective reflection becomes accidental, and truth as subjectivity is lost. Descartes shares Hegel's fate of falling under the Kierkegaardian irony and devastating intellectual harpooning. It was Descartes who provided modern philosophy with the cogito ergo sum for its foundation. Now, either the I, which is the subject of the cogito, refers to a particular existing human being, in which case nothing is proved. If I am thinking, what wonder that I am? Or else the I refers to a universal pure ego. But such an entity has only a conceptual existence, and the ego and the ergo loses its meaning, the proposition being reduced to a tautology. The attempt by Descartes to prove his existence by the fact that he thinks leads to no real conclusion, for insofar as he thinks, he has already abstracted from his own existence. Descartes had already prepared the stage for the later Hegel's identification of abstract thought and reality. Contra Descartes, Climacus is ready to defend the claim that the real subject is not the cognitive subject, but rather the ethically engaged, existing subject. In both Descartes and Hegel, he finds that cognition and reason have been viciously abstracted from the concrete particularity of existence. The subjective thinker emphatically rejects the rationalist's reification of reason, but he in no way denies the validity of thought so long as it is existentially rooted. The subjective thinker is indeed a thinker who makes use of thought in seeking to penetrate the structures of his subjectivity and so to understand himself in his existence. The nobility of the Greek thinker, particularly Socrates, is that he was able to do this. He existed in advance of speculation and the system. The subjective thinker is at the same time a thinker and an existing human being. This is a truth, says Climacus, a statement which, deserving emphasis, cannot too often be repeated, and the neglect of which has brought about much confusion. Kierkegaard was by no means an opponent of thought. He insisted only that thought be placed back into existence, following its vicious abstraction by Hegel. To quote, "If thought speaks deprecatingly of the imagination, imagination in turn speaks deprecatingly of thought, and likewise with feeling. The task is not to exalt the one at the expense of the other, but to give them an equal status, to unify them in simultaneity. The medium in which they are unified in existence is the medium in which they are unified is existence." End quote. When the subjective thinker thus makes the movement of understanding himself in his existence, he discovers that in the order of reality, as distinct from the order of abstract thought, individuals, and individuals alone, exist. Existence is indelibly individual in character. Kierkegaard's philosophy is a crusade for the reality of the concrete individual. The individual, enkelter in Danish, was Kierkegaard's central category. It is in this category that he saw bound up any importance that he as a subjective thinker might have. This category was so decisive for his whole literary effort that he asked that it be inscribed on his tombstone, and it was. The human self is not humanity in general. Humanity does not exist. Only individual human beings exist. Existential reality resides not in the genus of the species, but in the concrete individual. Universals like crowds or abstractions which have neither hands nor feet. To exist means to be an individual, but to exist also means to be in a process of becoming. To quote, "An existing individual is constantly in process of becoming. The actual existing subject thinker constantly reproduces this existential situation in his thoughts and translates all his thinking into terms of process." End quote. Although Hegel in his logic had much to say about processes in which opposites are combined into higher unities, his doctrine of becoming is ultimately illusory because it does not understand process from the point of view of concrete existence. Logic and pure thought can never capture the existential reality of becoming, for logical entities are states of being which are timeless and fixed. In the moment that Hegel wrote his logic with the intention of encompassing the whole of reality, he forfeited the concrete becoming in which the subjective thinker finds himself disclosed. But this intractable reality of concrete becoming remains as a source of profound embarrassment for the Hegelian, particularly when he is ready to write the last paragraph of his system and finds that existence is not yet finished. Kierkegaardian irony reaches its height when Climacus undertakes to satirize the system. "I shall be as willing as the next man to fall down in worship before the system, if only I can manage to set eyes on it. Hitherto I have had no success, and though I have young legs, I am almost weary of running back and forth between Herod and Pilate. Once or twice I have been on the verge of bending the knee, but at the last moment, when I already had my handkerchief spread on the ground to avoid soiling my trousers, and I had made a trusting appeal to one of the initiated who stood by, 'Tell me now, sincerely, is it entirely finished? For if so, I will kneel down before it, even at the risk of ruining a pair of trousers. For on account of the heavy traffic to and fro, the road has become quite muddy. I always receive the answer, no, it is not yet quite finished.'" End quote. And so there was another postponement of the system and of my homage. He added, "System and finality are correlative concepts, but existence which is constantly in the process of becoming is never finished. Thus an existential system is impossible. Reality itself is a system, but a system only for God. There can be no system for an existing individual who always stands on the throes of becoming. An existence involves individuality, and becoming so assuredly does it involve the future. One exists in a process of becoming by facing a future. The subjective thinker is passionately and earnestly interested in the time of immediate experience as it qualifies his existence. Time for the existent subject is not a time in general, an abstract cosmic time which is spatialized through objectivizing categories. His interest has to do with the time of his inner experience, time as it is concretely lived rather than abstractly known. In the subjective thinker's immediate experience of time, the future has priority. His life is lived primarily out of the future, for in his subjectivity he understands himself as moving into a future. This future generates uncertainty and anxiety. Tomorrow may rob me of all my earthly goods and leave me desolate. The subjective thinker, when he penetrates to the core of his subjectivity, thus finds the uncertainty of life itself. Wherever there is subjectivity, there is uncertainty. Death is one of the most ethically significant uncertainties of life. Subjective thought discloses death as an imminent possibility, but for the most part, man devises means of concealing this imminent possibility. He approaches the fact of death through the eyes of objective reflection, and thus conveniently transforms it into something in general. Viewed objectively, death is a general and universal occurrence, which befalls all forms of life. Viewed subjectively, death is an imminent uncertainty which pertains to my particular existence, and which makes a difference for my individual decisions. Death is thus apprehended not as a generalized empirical factuality, but as a task or a deed. Quote, "If the task of life is to become subjective, then the thought of death is not for the individual subject something in general, but is verily a deed." End quote. Death, subjectively understood, becomes a task in that it is defined in terms of its ethical expression. It is experienced and appropriated in an anticipatory conception in such a way that it transforms the whole of man's life. When death is existentially appropriated, then every decision receives a singular importance. If death is imminent, every choice has infinite worth, and every moment is a unique occasion for decisive action. Death makes a difference for life. In the subjective movements of his engaged existence, the subjective thinker discloses his existence as qualified by individuality, becoming time and death. Time and death. Already in these movements, the pathway is open for decisive action. The category of decision becomes a centralizing concept for the subjective thinker. In facing a future, the existing subject is called to decision. Thus, the subjective thinker is at the same time an ethical thinker. He understands his personal existence as a task and a responsibility. He must choose in order to attain his authentic selfhood. His essential humanity is not given, it is achieved through decision. The greatness of man is that he is an either-or. This either-or becomes a matter of indifference for the Hegelian. In Hegel's timeless categories, there is no place for decisive action or ethical commitment. Quote, "Ethics has been crowded out of the system, and as a substitute for it, there has been included a something which confuses the historical with the individual, the bewildering and noisy demands of the age with the eternal demand that conscience makes upon the individual. Ethics concentrates upon the individual, and ethically it is the task of every individual to become an entire man. Just as it is the ethical presupposition that every man is born in such a condition that he can become one." End quote. The objective reflection which is so peculiar to the system transforms everyone into an observer. But existing individuals are actors as well as observers. They make choices which affect the whole of their lives. They are engaged in action which is decisive for themselves as well as for others. The ethically existing subject is thus of utmost importance, but for the Hegelian, who is concerned with the general developments of the world history and of the meditation of opposites in this world's history, the ethical subject remains unacknowledged. Kierkegaard regarded the existentially decisive act for the ethically engaged subject as not an external action, but rather as an internal decision. It is inward passion rather than external consequences which constitutes the criterion of ethical action. The person who does not own a penny can be as charitable as the person who gives away a kingdom. Let us suppose, says Climacus, that the Levite who found the man that had fallen among thieves between Jericho and Jerusalem was inwardly concerned to help sufferers in distress. Let us suppose further that when he met the victim, he was frightened at the possibility of robbers nearby and hastened on lest he also become a victim. He failed to act, giving no help to the sufferer. But after having left the victim, he was overcome by remorse and hurried back to the scene, but arrived too late. The Samaritan had already helped the victim in his distress. If this were the sequence of events, would not one have to say that the Levite acted? Indeed he acted, says Climacus, and in an inwardly decisive sense, even though his action had no external expression. Much time is devoted in the Postscript to a delineation of the stages or existence spheres, a delineation which Kierkegaard had already undertaken in two of his earlier works, Either Or of 1843 and Stages on Life's Way 1845. However, for the first time in his writings, we have an analysis and description of irony and humour as transitional stages between the aesthetical and ethical, and the ethical and the religious, respectively. The aesthetical stage is the stage of experimentation. The aestheticist is one who experiments with various possibilities but never commits himself in passionate choice. He experiments with love but never commits himself in marriage. He experiments with thought but never commits himself in action. A constant flight from the responsibility of decision characterizes the aestheticist. Thus he lacks the decisive content of subjectivity, which is inwardness, earnestness, and passion. It is only in the ethical stage that these decisive determinants appear. The transition to the ethical stage is by way of irony. Climacus speaks of irony as the boundary zone between the aesthetical and the ethical. The purpose of irony is to rouse man from his unauthentic aesthetical floundering to an ethical consciousness. Irony elicits the discrepancy between the inward and outward, as this discrepancy is expressed in the life of man. Irony makes man aware of the discrepancy between his inward lack of wisdom and his outward claim of its possession. It makes man aware that his outward profession of virtue betrays an inward lack of it. Irony constitutes the first awareness of the ethical, seeks to bring these suppressed discrepancies to light, and thus drives beyond itself to the next stage. The ethical stage is the sphere of decisive action and self-commitment. The ethical man has resolutely chosen himself and exists in passion and in inwardness. The personality of the aestheticist is dispersed because of his floundering in possibilities. The personality of the ethical man is unified or centralized because he has been able to commit himself in definite modes of action. But the ground of this unification and the ultimate source of this commitment is not disclosed until the self apprehends itself in the movements of the religious sphere. Although in tension, the ethical and the religious are so close, says Climacus, that they are in constant communication with one another. It is for this reason that the two stages are often hyphenated and designated as the ethico-religious sphere. The boundary zone between the ethical and the religious is humour. The ethical thinker drives beyond the ethical to the religious through the expression of humour, in which there is a protest against the externalization of ethical norms and standards. The humorist is aware of this externalization, which tends to become identified with the religious, contests it as the proper measure, but still is unable to establish a God relationship in terms of religious passion, stricte sic dictus. Kierkegaard's provocative book Fear and Trembling of 1843 incomparably expresses this suspension of an externalized ethics through the movement of faith, exemplified by Abraham in the intended sacrifice of his son Isaac. Only when the existing subject has apprehended his relationship to God as a relationship qualified by inwardness and passion does he proceed to the religious stage. The new determinant, which is introduced in the religious stage, is the determinant of suffering. Suffering is the highest intensification of subjectivity. In it we see the fullest expression of inwardness. The suffering which is acknowledged in this stage, however, must not be confused with the poetic representations of suffering peculiar to the aesthetical stage, nor with the reflection about suffering, which is always qualitatively different from the fact of suffering, nor with suffering as a simple outward ethical manifestation. Religious suffering is an expression of an inward God relationship like that of Job, which remains opaque to the aesthetical and ethical consciousness. The religious stage is internally differentiated by two levels of existence: religiousness A and religiousness B. Religiousness A is the religion of immanence. Religiousness B is the paradoxical religiousness, that in which the qualitative distinction between God and man is disclosed, and God's presence in time is revealed in the paradox of Christ. The distinction between A and B also expresses the corresponding distinction between guilt consciousness and sin consciousness. Guilt, properly understood, is a determinant of religiousness A. Sin is a determinant of religiousness B. Guilt is a disrelationship of the subject with himself. It points to an internal fissure within consciousness, which results because of an alienation from his absolute telos. It is still a movement within immanence. In religiousness, B, guilt becomes sin. The disrelationship of this subject with himself is now apprehended as a disrelationship with God. The existing subject can acquire a guilt consciousness through the purely human movement of dialectics, in which he understands himself as alienated from himself in the process of becoming. But sin consciousness requires a disclosure by God so as to reveal to man that his guilt is at one and the same time an implication of sin. The pagan can have no consciousness of sin. Sin consciousness emerges only in the subject's awareness of himself as existing in a disrelationship with God. This God is a God who has entered time and history. It is thus that religiousness B finds its supreme expression in Christianity with its teaching of the absolute paradox, or deity in time. As the paradoxical religiousness B affirms a qualitative distinction between God and man. God is wholly and utterly transcendent to the temporal order. Thus, religiousness B breaks with religiousness A. There is no natural kinship between the eternal and the temporal, and so the advent of eternity in time is disclosed as a paradox. Christ is the absolute paradox, who reveals God in time, makes man aware of his sin, and calls him to faith and decisive commitment through which sin is overcome. In his analysis and description of the religious stage as the crown and culmination of the three stages, which must be understood not in terms of temporal sequences of successive development, development, but rather in terms of co-present qualifications of subjectivity, the author makes his central intention quite apparent. The leading question which concerns Climacus is already put to the reader in the introduction. Quote, "The subjective problem concerns the relationship of the individual to Christianity. To put it quite simply, how may I, Johannes Climacus, participate in the happiness promised by Christianity?" End quote. It is significant that in the appendix, quote, the question is raised, and I quote, "For an understanding with the reader, now I ask how I am to become a Christian." End quote. This is indeed Kierkegaard's central question, posed not only in the Postscript, but in all his other writings. Explaining his own perspective as an author, Kierkegaard informs his reader in his book, The Point of View of 1849, that underlying the whole of his literary work is the central concern of how to become a Christian. A task which is extremely difficult in Christendom. At the end. Now, did any of that make any sense to you? Please let me know what you think in the comments.